My name is Jocelyn, and when I was a teenager, I argued with my parents. That's probably pretty common, but for me, personally, I mostly argued to sleep in later, and I feel like that's also pretty common. But you'd probably be happy to find out that that's actually scientifically backed by us, that we can sleep in longer. And that's because we actually found that after puberty, there's biological shift in the internal clocks for teenagers, so they actually need different sleep than adults and children. And then also teenagers, just on average, don't get enough sleep. We do need more sleep than everyone else. And then we also found that teenagers who receive less sleep end up having a higher risk of obesity, depression, and they can even get in more car accidents. So because of this, I find it's pretty hard to argue that we need to schedule high school classes to be later in the day so we can improve the general health of teenagers because they need to sleep in longer. And so to get into this, I would start by saying that to explain the biological shift, that's called, to bring in like REM cycles, that's about 3.5 hours. But if you used to fall asleep at 9 o'clock because your parents would teach you, as most have a bedtime, well, now that's going to get shifted 2 hours later, and that's been found by a study in 2014 by the National Sleep Federation, by the Nemours Foundation. And if we wake teenagers too early, it could cause them to receive less rest and less time in this REM cycle. And also, high schools tend to start as early as 7 a.m. And so if we're waking up a teenager at 5 a.m. to get there on time because they need to shower, eat, maybe get ready, get there, then that's even less time than maybe 7.5 hours. And then also my next point is that teenagers, they do need to have an average of more sleep. And that's because also after school, they tend to have to do their homework. Sometimes most people have sports obligations or other after-school activities, and that goes into the evening, so they may not even get to sleep or maybe even get to rest. And that also leads for teenagers to not get enough socialized time, which can lead to other mental problems. And then it's pretty generally known that sleep affects every major system of the body. And it can affect even more things than just your mood and health, and pretty much just your overall performance. And that was found by a study in 2014 by Ms. Gupta, also in the Nemours Federation. And lastly, teenagers who receive less sleep, they do have a higher risk of other health problems that can be more physical, like obesity, as well as mentally, like depression. And that's because, and most of us tend to feel this way, you feel kind of brain dead, and that was found in an editorial done in response to a research paper by Paul Orns. And when you arrive to school early because of inadequate sleep, you tend to have these problems with attention, memory, decision making, even your reaction time, and it can end up affecting your creativity because of your mood. And that's everything that you're supposed to be training in school. So at this point, these teenagers are going to school and not even training these skills that they're supposed to be working on, which could be simply solved by just letting them sleep in an hour or two longer. And then the students, they end up sleeping at their desk or zoning out, which a lot of people are doing right now. And then drowsy driving also ends up affecting a lot of teenagers, because the National Sleep Federation, they also found that while we do associate drowsy driving with the middle of the night, like 2 to 4 a.m., it also happens in the mid-afternoon, around 3 or 4 o'clock, and that's when these teenagers usually get out of school and are driving home, which can lead to more car accidents. And even more importantly, when you're tired, you're just not going to get as many good grades, you're not going to pay attention. If you're falling asleep in school, that's not a good look on, it's not a good way to come across to your professors and teenagers in class. Professors and teachers in class. And then a lot of parents now tend to even let their children stay home from class completely because they want them to get good health and get enough sleep. And then it's also really easy to discourage teenagers in other ways because getting less sleep also gives you worse skin, which is not great for teenagers, and that gives them another reason to get out of class if they have like too many pimples on their faces. So because of these points, again, that teenagers do biologically shift their internal clocks, as well as them needing more hours of sleep, as well as later. And because of that, they do have a higher risk to gain way more health risks that we do need to move these high school classes later to improve their general health.
All right, it was a little confusing because basically you gave the proposition before you gave the, you gave the preview before you gave the proposition. So the supporting structure is actually preceding what the argument is, and that threw me off a bit. Once you got to the body of the speech, I thought you cited your first 2 points pretty clearly. The third point was not as clear, and it felt like you were wandering around a little bit on that supporting point. So I think that the organization kind of fell apart about halfway through the speech. You explain concepts reasonably well. Proving the concepts, I think, is a little bit thinner. There's a lot of places where there are big assertions and inferences being made, and you rely on hypothetical examples to illustrate a particular point without any documentation. I think the research that talks about how people need more sleep, I think that that's probably believable. It's a little bit vague about how much more sleep they need. And your claim, for example, that there's some biorhythm that is involved in this, I didn't hear the evidence that was specific to that, and that it's unique to people in this particular age category. I think that that's missing here. Basically, the argument is that we need more sleep. And you know what? I think everybody probably needs more sleep. So why is it unique to the schools? One of the things that wasn't very clear is why the cycle has to start, why can't they go to bed an hour earlier instead of getting up an hour later? That was not quite clear to me, except that you had this one section where you said, well, sometimes there are other outside activities that might restrict their ability to do these things, sports obligations and that sort of thing. But again, that was all hypothetical. There weren't any statistics on that. There's not even a piece of testimony here that talks about those sorts of issues. And the idea that teenagers in particular are using all their time productively up to the moment that they go to sleep, I think that's a big assumption that is probably going to be challenged by the response speaker. And then we get the idea of people being brain dead. One of the things I think was a little problematic with the evidence that you did have was that you have a tendency to just paraphrase what you read instead of giving us direct quotes. And I think the direct quotes would make the argument a little bit clearer, and it would also sound more definitive and add to your credibility there. Excuse me. The drowsy driving issue seems to be associated with the time of day. I'm not exactly sure that it's associated with teenagers. I didn't hear evidence that was specific to that particular group in that category. So that's another place where you've got some general information about sleep deprivation that is being applied in this circumstance simply because of the hours of school without necessarily showing that it definitely applies to the students and their behaviors. You said hypothetically we could have accidents and that sort of thing. I'm going, okay, well, hypothetically I suppose a lot of things are possible, but I think we need a little bit better evidence if we're going to do this. You have a pseudo-policy claim also. I thought that you did suggest that there's a need to adjust this. I think it would probably be better to suggest that there's a harm that occurs by failing to have classes start later, or that some advantage would occur if classes started later. That would be a better way maybe to phrase that proposition. All right.